The text is 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 38 through 49. Thank you, Brock and Mike, for that beautiful instrumental, to Amanda for sharing about the persecuted church, to Helen for leading our offertory prayer, and to you for being here in worship this morning. The text sounds like it came from off the front page of this morning's newspaper. It is surreal to be examining these texts and find some of the same adjectives that describe this region of the world today. Bill Givens gave us the first part of the story expressing David's willingness to serve King Saul. Picking up in verse 37-38, we find Saul giving David instructions and then a fairly graphic description of the unfolding events. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him, reaching into his bag and taking out a stone. He slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. That's the Bible version, and we didn't read that in our children's Bible. It's really not a children's story, is it? It's a story that if made into a movie, it would be rated PG-13 or R for the violence. But there are several children's stories and life stories that echo the theme of the stories of David and Goliath. One such is the story that became a movie called Mighty Ducks. It's a David versus Goliath kind of story. If you watch the film, maybe with your children or grandchildren, Gordon Bombay, a high-priced lawyer with a prestigious law firm, is arrested for a DUI in order to perform 500 hours of community service. His assignment is to coach the Pee Wee hockey team made of a bunch of misfits and the troubled kids who are from the inner city of Minneapolis. By his own admission, Gordon Bombay states, "I hate kids and I hate hockey." The first game he coaches, the team has to play the best team in the league, the Hawks, and the Hawks were a well-coached team from the wealthy suburbs, and they were big and they were mean and they knew how to play hockey. The coach said that they would win at all cost, and they beat this team of misfits coached by Bombay 17-0. Well, it was a very ugly game, but if you watch the movie, there's a level of maturity sets in, and the underdog and the misfits and the trouble kids get better and better and better, and Gordon begins to overcome his own inner giants and takes a real interest in the group, which empowers them even more. And something that no one forecast, they made the playoffs. And you can guess who they faced in the championship. The Hawks that had been their giant from the very beginning. Well, there are a lot of stories in life like that that end well. The problem is when we face the giants in our own life, in our own community, in our own workplace, the underdog doesn't always win. But oh, how inspired we are when the underdog performs well. The story of David's triumph over the massive Goliath gives us a lot of valuable lessons in how to confront the giants in our life. Too many to list, but I would like to list 7. My preaching professor would roll over in his grave. Someone asked in preaching class at New Orleans, how many points should there be in a good sermon? And he responded, at least 1. Well, usually there are 3 to 4 bullet points, but if you're a note taker, there are actually 7 quick bullet points, so you need to listen real fast this morning. For in the story of David and Goliath, we see a literal giant, a towering figure of intimidation and fear. Goliath is a seasoned warrior. He was a physical manifestation of the grip fear can have on each and every one of us. And many of the giants we face today may not be physical. They may be situations. They may be circumstances. They may be struggles that seem to us at the time insurmountable. The things in life that cause us to tremble with fear and anxiety. They cast a shadow over our life of fear and doubt. And they certainly deride our own sense of self-confidence. Craig Loudenborough wrote several years ago, always remember, the size of the giant in front of you will be determined by the size of the giant within you. And so the story begins. First, I think is a takeaway from this story found in 1 Samuel 17, is to note that giants come in all shapes and sizes. They did at that time. Israel had known feast and famine. They had known occupation and exile. And they certainly were trembling after being confronted by this Philistine giant. David faced a literal giant, but it represented all the giants that Israel had faced in their past and would face in their future. Today, by the way, it's ironic that Israel faces a giant of a terrorist group in Hamas, not the Palestinian people. We're a church, and when we pray for the Israeli citizens and for the Palestinians. God doesn't take sides, and if someone tells you God's always on the side of Israel, they're wrong. God is always on the side of the innocent, the men, the women, and the children who are the casualties of such a brutal attack. But it's ironic that this war we're witnessing on TV is almost in the same exact geographic location. The Gaza Strip, prior to being called Gaza, was a territory that was known as Philistia, from which Philistines came, which had a group of people that were extra large and extra tall. Max Lucado reminds us that David had very slim odds against such a daunting giant. What odds, he says, did David have against this giant? Better odds than you have perhaps against your own giant. Lucado says that your Goliath doesn't carry around a sword or a shield. He brandishes blades of unemployment, abandonment, sexual abuse, and depression. Your giant doesn't parade up and down the hills of Elah. He prances through your office, your bedroom, and your classroom. He brings bills you can't pay, grades you can't make, and people you can't please. Whiskey you can't resist, pornography you can't refuse, a career you can't escape, a past you can't shake, and a future you're afraid to face. You see, during the course of life, you and I have or will face gargantuan obstacles in the shape of a monstrous diagnosis, an oversized academic challenge, a supersized sense of anxiety or depression or loneliness, or even a mammoth conflict or dispute of which there seems to be no reconciliation. Giants come in all shapes and sizes, but never be intimidated by the giant you're facing. It only takes one moment of cowering in the face of the giant for the giant to get the upper hand. Sometimes giants look large because they are indeed large. At other times, the giants in our lives look large because we have over-magnified them. We have given them too much credit. We have been intimidated not just by the giant, but by their larger shadow. We have to have faith and we have to have courage not to be intimidated. The late Billy Graham loved to say, courage is contagious. When a brave man takes a stand, the spine of others stiffen. And that was certainly the case when David, perhaps the youngest and certainly the smallest of Saul's volunteer warriors, agreed to go forward to meet Goliath. Roy Bennett has a little book called Light in the Heart, and he tells us that no matter what we face, how odd the circumstances, how strong the challenges, how dark the shadows, you must believe in yourself, for you are braver than you think, you're more talented than you know, and you are more capable than you imagine. This has been quite a football weekend for a lot of us, watching games from start to finish. I was thinking yesterday as I watched just a little highlight of the Auburn game about the legendary coach Ralph Shug Jordan from Auburn, after whom the stadium is named and whom some of you remember. Shug Jordan loved to say when one of his teams was a severe underdog placing an undefeated giant, he would always tell the team and the press, he would say to them something like, always remember, Goliath was a 40-point underdog. David was a 40-point underdog against Goliath. And many of us are more than 40-point underdogs against the giants of our life. So it's important to trust the Lord to enable you and equip you, both individually and collectively, as an individual believer, as a husband, as a father, as a wife, as a grandparent, as a coach, as an attorney, as a business person, as a student, to trust the Lord to enable and equip you to face your giants. It's important as a family, as a community, as a business, as a team, and even as a congregation, when you face giants, to trust the Lord to equip and enable you. In today's Bible story, David was able to go forward because he was confident he was not alone. He was confident the Lord was with him and had called him to the task. When we're participating in God's mission, whatever it is, when we're obeying God's instruction, when we're following God's direction, we can be sure God is with us and that God frees us and liberates us to use the gifts and the tools that we've been given. I hope you caught the part of the story where once David volunteered, Saul wanted to give him Saul's armor. Saul wanted to give David Saul's weapons. And when David tried to take on the weapons and the wardrobe of his mentor, he began to bog down because David said, I'm not used to them. The same is true of a person, the same is true of the business, the same is true of a congregation, which tries to imitate what someone down the road is doing because it's not you. It's not your circumstances. It's not your skill set. It's not your strengths. And you're not used to it. You're not leveraging the gifts God has given you. David refused to take the weapons of Saul But he chose to use what he was good at. That's important for individual believers, it's important for business people, and it's important for members of the congregation in the 21st century. Do what you're good at. You can have a dream list of all the things you want to be, but God wants to start with what we're good at. And as we even grow the mission and the congregation here, it begins with what we're good at, not bringing people in, but sending people out, which causes people to come in because we're doing what we're called to do. We are being the church, and we are good at what God has equipped and enabled us to do. Each individual has more gifts, more unique talents, and more unique skills than you're even aware of. Learn to leverage what you've been given. I talk to people week in and week out, and several this week, who are facing some giants you and I know nothing about. And unless you've been there waiting on the prognosis or the pathology report, you don't know what a giant is. Unless you've been there waiting to sign the divorce paper, you don't know what a giant is. Unless you've been in the office waiting to see if you're the one that gets the pink slip, you don't know what the giant is. But what I would say to all of us here is that if God has equipped and enabled us, and if we're trusting in God, God can use what we've been given, not what we're lacking in, to accomplish God's purpose in our life. And by the way, that's not just true of us individually, it's true of a congregation. I believe that God has placed every gift that we need right here in this congregation to be the people of God has called us to be in this community. Well, Pastor, we don't have this. I know we're a small band of believers, but small bands of believers turn the world upside down when they're obedient to what God has called them to do. And if we're obedient with the gifts God has given us, God will provide the gifts and skills and talents that will fill in the gaps as we move along. But if we sit on our hunches, waiting for someone else to come and do the work, we will be the one that goes down to our giant and our Goliath, and not the one that triumphs in the end. Use the gifts and the tools you've been given. In fact, I think one of the important things from this text is a reminder, whatever your giant is, whatever gargantuan challenge you're facing, look a giant in the eye. The longer we avoid or delay facing our giant, the bigger the giant seems to become. Address the giant in your life head on. Get the right perspective. When Goliath came against the Israelites, the soldiers all thought, he is so big. That's what the text said. He is so big, we can never conquer him. We can never kill him. But if you look at it through David's eyes, David looked at the very same giant and thought, he is so big, how can I miss? Sometimes the giants in our life are so big, look them in the eye, face them head on, and realize that the target we've been given is a part of the fulfillment of our mission. Every giant has a point of vulnerability. Every circumstance, every situation, every individual that becomes that gargantuan challenge in our life has a point of vulnerability. By the way, Malcolm Gladwell, who actually wrote the book, David and Goliath, is for the business world. It's a book titled Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. A good book for anyone who's in a career that involves relationships, marketing, and community connections. Malcolm Gladwell writes, giants are not what we think they are. The same qualities that give them strength are often their source of greatest weakness. David hit Goliath at his most exposed point of vulnerability. Whenever you face a giant, use your strength against the giant's weakness. Finally, God may use the little things. We put so much emphasis in our life on big things, big raises, big houses, big cars, big accolades. But in the Bible, notice the importance of little things. In the teachings of Jesus, notice how often he talked about little things. In the story of David and Goliath, underline all the little things that brought David on the scene. God may use the little things to help us overwhelm the giants in our lives. You don't have to become a giant to defeat a giant. We often say, if I were just more talented, if I were just bigger, if I were just better, if I were just better looking, if I were just more healthy, if I just had more influence, if I were in so-and-so's shoes. When actually, God uses the little things and the little circumstances and the little acts of kindness and the little people to overwhelm the giants in life on a regular basis. David used a sling and a few stones. That's what I've heard all my life. Go back and read the biblical text. David used a sling and one stone. He put 5 stones in the pouch. I've often wondered, what were the other 4 for? Were they there in case he missed? It seems like they were keepsakes to tell the stories to the children that were to come after him, because David used the little stone. The little stone that David took from the bag became the mustard seed of the Old Testament. It's a reminder that in the spiritual walk, Lilliputian faith always trumps gargantuan arrogance. Lilliputian faith always trumps gargantuan arrogance. Not one of us, by the way, would condone even the violence described in this text or the violence we see on today's news. But what we can take away from the story is the challenge to live assured that there will be great obstacles that arise in life. And if all is going well with you now, the obstacles will come. And if you are confronted in this season with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, there will be a season of peace and calm yet to come. Live assured that there will be obstacles that arise, but live determined that a giant will never get the final word in your life. Do not give up, do not lose hope, do not cower down. Giants do not have the final word. Whether in life, at war, or in sports. I mentioned Israel. It's the first time in my life, not in the lives of many of you, but in my life, there have been 2 such monumental wars going on at the same time. And the war in Ukraine, where a giant superpower is picking on a smaller underdog, is another David and Goliath story. And we have to pray and be confident that at the end, the giant doesn't win. But it's hard and it's tough. But we have to muster up the faith and the courage to believe that in the end, it's the little things that will cause the bigger giants to fall. One final story. I just graduated high school, started to college my sophomore year. February of 1980, the U.S. Olympic hockey team took the ice in Lake Placid, New York, to face the toughest hockey team in the world. You remember the story. Some of you were watching as well. No one had defeated the USSR, which we still referred to back then even as Russia. 2 weeks before the Olympic competition, the Russians beat the Americans 12-2. That night, there was something different in the air. The U.S. defeated Russia, the very same team, 4-2 in one of the most stunning upsets in all of sports history. Most of us who watched that particular Olympic series remember the film clip as the clock is winding down and the players raced out onto the ice to celebrate. And Al Michaels, the sports announcer, you remember that? Al Michaels was calling the game for ABC Sports. And remember what he said? He looked at the camera, looked at the arena, looked back at the camera, spoke into the microphone. Do you believe in miracles? Well, that's still a question, isn't it? Whatever the giants are in your life, whatever your cause of anxiety, whatever triggers your depression, whatever causes you to sense loneliness, as you face your giant, do you believe in miracles? Do you believe that if you trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding, that He will bring it to pass? Perhaps the biggest giants we will ever face are not outside of us, but the ones that live inside of us. Fear, hopelessness, and even personal guilt. As Christians, we believe that one of the best reasons to become a follower of Jesus is the forgiveness He offers and the purpose He gives. And if you're looking for forgiveness for all that weighs you down with guilt, and you're looking for purpose amidst the chaos of life's messiness, look no further than Jesus Himself. Why not begin today following Him, not just as your Lord and Savior, but as your friend and as your guide? In a moment, we're going to stand and sing some words of commitment, but I have some really good news to share. 2 weeks from today, we have confirmed our date for baptism. Listen carefully. You will read this in the church newsletter. It will be a grand day because we will meet for worship in the front of the sanctuary nearest the choir surrounding the baptistry. Although we have 8 candidates already awaiting baptism, we have 3 that have confirmed for that date. Following baptism, we will pass the bread and the cup and celebrate these new members through the act and ordinance of Holy Communion. And after we share the symbolic communion, we will return from the sanctuary to the Peachtree Room for a Thanksgiving lunch together that will be served here on that Sunday following the service. It's a great time to contact friends and family, to invite those you know who have been sitting on the sidelines, and tell them, come and see what the Lord is doing at Wieuca. Now, we're having conversations with more about baptism. And if you're here this morning or watching online, or if you have a friend or family member that's been thinking about baptism, now is your grand opportunity. Although there will be opportunities later on, we'd love to have a conversation with you. You can contact me or Rick or Angie or Josh, and any one of us would be glad to talk with you about your personal faith, your baptism, or your church membership. And one of our ministers will be at the cross in the foyer of the Peachtree Room following the service this morning. Now, as we celebrate our faith and thank God for all that God has done, let's stand and sing together as Rick leads us.